I'm Dr. Erin Katribe. I am the Director of National Vet Programs for Best Friends, and our shelter medicine team consults on all things shelter medicine related and outbreaks. And distemper is one of the number one things that we consult on when we're working with shelters across the country. And so I'm excited today to talk to you about some of the things that we've learned and some of the new strategies and the updates to help you manage distemper and prevent distemper more effectively in your shelters. Just a little bit of housekeeping. For any polls or questions or chatting that you want to do, we use the chat box. And then we also have the Q&A box for content questions. Other members of my team will try to pop in and answer some of those if they're easy to type responses to. And if not, I'll try to save some time at the end. And then, of course, we'll give you contact information. So if we don't get to your question or if you think of something later, just reach out to us. We're happy to answer your specific shelter questions and help you in whatever way is useful. All right, so let's get started. My first question for all of you is going to be a poll, and it is, who has blank a dog with distemper? Seen, sheltered, transported out, transferred in, euthanized? What about fostered? And who has saved a dog with distemper? We'll give you a couple minutes or a couple seconds to answer that. When I was in vet school, I was taught two things about canine distemper. One was that it was a disease that I would never see. We've had a great vaccine around for decades, so you'll never see this disease. And then I was taught that if you do see it, in that rare case, like, it's absolutely a death sentence. And so that is why I ask you these questions. Let's see. So 85% of you have seen a dog with distemper. Many of you have fostered, many of you have transferred in or out, had them in your shelters. And what I love is that 30% of you, so almost a third of you, have saved a dog with distemper. So both of those things that I was taught in vet school, hands down, they were wrong, right? We see distemper in our shelters, and we can save the lives of distemper dogs. These are all distemper dogs whose lives were saved in shelters by the work that you and your colleagues are doing to really push the boundaries of lives that we can save. All right, so this is going to be our outline for today. First, I want to run through some myths and misperceptions of distemper. We'll highlight what's new in distemper management in shelters, and then we'll talk about outbreak prevention. So if you're in a place where you see distemper, if you are transporting dogs from places that have endemic distemper, what can you do to ensure that a single case of distemper does not turn into an outbreak? And so we'll talk about all of those things. What we're not going to do today is a comprehensive review of this whole disease. I think there's plenty of content, great content that's out there, and you can find that other places. What I really want to focus on today are these actionable strategies that you can implement, things that are new. And you can always reach out to us for support with any of these things. I want to counter some of these misperceptions that we see and that we hear again and again in shelters. And then again, just tell you what's new. What are the things that are really going to hopefully open up your ability to treat this disease in the shelter environment. All right, so let's start with some myths and misperceptions. First, myth. If it's distemper, we'll see neurological signs, and that is a myth. That's something that I hear. Only 10% of dogs develop neurological signs. This can be a disease that presents with just respiratory signs, and in the vast, vast majority of cases, that is all that we see. So if you are potentially worried about distemper in your shelter, if you identify one dog with neurological signs, that means 9 other dogs in your shelter that are probably upper respiratory, 9 other dogs potentially have distemper. Another thing I sometimes hear is that, okay, recognizing that sometimes it's just respiratory, but it's always going to be this like super thick nasal discharge that it will always look like this. And that is also a myth. And in many of the shelters that we go to that see a lot of distemper, sometimes it looks just like this. It looks like just a little bit of eye boogers, or sometimes it looks just like a cough. It can look just like any of the other run-of-the-mill canine infectious respiratory disease that you see in your shelter. And so in an outbreak scenario, or in scenarios where we know we have confirmed distemper, every single one of these pets gets isolated and tested. Now, if you don't see this disease, if it's not common in your area, I would not fret, and I'm not suggesting that you PCR every dog that has little eye boogies. But if you're in an outbreak or you're in a high-risk area, recognize it's not just this like classic thick nasal discharge. And the flip side of this, I would say, is we see plenty of dogs that have discharge that looks like this that are not distemper. Sometimes we see just GI signs. I've had essentially like outbreaks that are full of just dogs, young dogs that have what we think is parvo, and they keep testing negative. And when we actually go in distemper PCR, then it can be distemper. And so again, just thinking about your area and the diseases that you see, it can look like any one of these things, all of these things, or just one of them. So GI, respiratory, and those neurological signs. But by and large, it's primary respiratory. Okay, vaccine interference. So this is a question that comes up a lot. Many of you may have seen a distemper PCR report that looks a lot like this. And one of the things that's on this report from IDEXX, it is regarding the viral load. And so what it says is, so CDV viral load is low within the range expected for vaccine interference. If the dog has had a recent vaccine with a modified live distemper, then this result may be due to detection of the vaccine strain. And while this is true, low counts can also be really early or really late infection, so early infection or recovering dogs. And in the face of an outbreak, or if we know we have distemper, we have to handle these dogs as if they are truly positive. This is a graph. This is PCR samples with virus quantity. This was taken from shelter dogs in an actual outbreak. So a total of 648 samples. This is multiple samples from the same dog. So they were tested repeat times over the course of this outbreak. This was a real distemper outbreak. This was real disease in these dogs. That red line is that vaccine cutoff. So for all of these dogs, that report reported out low viral counts that if you wanted to read it this way, you could say, oh gosh, these could have been vaccine. If you got those numbers in a different dog, you could have read them as vaccine, and they were all real infections. All right, sometimes I hear this, that distemper is the disease of only puppies, not adults. And that is also a myth. This is absolutely a disease that we see in adult dogs. Here are 3 examples of adult dogs, even geriatric dogs, that were involved in distemper outbreaks and had confirmed infection. And I can show you countless others or spreadsheets full of data. Our Hurricane Harvey response shelter, it's a number of years ago now, but that shelter was exclusively adults at the time of the outbreak. And we had 124 adult dogs that ultimately tested positive. How does this happen, right? I mentioned, we have a great vaccine, and that's true. But the challenge is that even adults, and definitely puppies, they're not protected the day they come into the shelter. And while we have great vaccines, those vaccines take some time to fully kick in. So this is some data looking at dogs that had protective titers on the day they came into shelters. It's separated out by region. So these happen to be Florida shelters. And it's as high as 57% in one of these 4 shelters or one of these 4 regions. 57% of dogs, this is all dogs, puppies and adults, were not protected at intake. And if we start separating it out by age, it's 83% of puppies were not protected the day they came into the shelter. But even a quarter, even 25% of adult dogs were not protected on intake, so not protected the day they came into the shelter. All right, well, we're vaccinating dogs on intake, right? So we're doing what we're supposed to do. And so our dogs are protected, right? I wish that were the case. We do recommend you vaccinate immediately on intake, if not before intake, if that's possible, right? But how long does it take for our vaccines to take effect? And so this is another study. In this, so the bars here, this is the percent of dogs that are protected. So this is essentially presenting it the opposite way as the last study that I showed you. But so at 2 different shelters, looking at the number of dogs on day 1, day 6 to 8, and they came into the shelter, and then on day 13 to 15. And you can see on day 1, some of them were protected, but we gave them a vaccine that day. And so by about a week in the shelter, many of them are becoming protected. They have protective titers. But it's not until we get to 2 weeks or sometimes more in the shelter that we're achieving 80, 90, 100, almost 100% of dogs that are protected. And then with puppies, all of this goes out the window, right? So we always have to consider puppies high risk. We'll dig into that a little bit later when we talk about outbreak prevention, but just remember, because of maternal antibodies, we never know when our vaccines kick in with puppies. And so we have to assume that they're vulnerable. And so we always consider them high risk, no matter how many vaccines they've had. We're open intake. We have a distemper outbreak, but we're open intake, so we can't close. I hear that. And that is also a myth. In outbreak situations, one thing that we often recommend is to reduce intake only to emergencies. So that means dogs that are very, very sick, injured, posing a risk to the community or at risk themselves, right? But outside of those emergency intakes, we can pause intake. And here's two examples of open admission shelters that paused or restricted intake to only emergencies during distemper outbreaks. Doing this certainly requires transparency with your community. And what I'll share is like the way that I message this, right, is that we have an ethical responsibility to protect pets in the shelter and in the community. And if all we're doing is continuing to bring in dogs into a shelter where we know we have distemper, right, like we are needlessly exposing these dogs to a disease that even with resources sometimes ends up being fatal. And especially if you're an under-resourced shelter and you have difficulty treating maybe even any of the cases, right? Like we can't just keep reintroducing unprotected dogs into the shelter. And so pausing intake, restricting it just to emergencies is something that we can do even if we're open admission. If this is something that you're facing, this is where our team can come in and help. And so if you are seeing distemper in your shelters, I encourage you to reach out and we can help you communicate this message both within your shelter and externally. Okay, well, if shelters are experiencing a distemper outbreak, they have to hold all the exposed dogs, all the infected dogs. They have to be held in the shelter. And I would say that's a myth. And exposed or infected dogs, they can shed for weeks or months, right? And that is a myth. And that is probably the most exciting update, if you haven't heard this yet, that we'll talk about a little bit later. But we have newer research that suggests that dogs are not contagious for as nearly as long as we once thought they were. We can also safely place these dogs in homes with adult vaccinated dogs. And so here are two examples of distemper dogs that were fostered successfully with other dogs. The little guy on the left wearing the Santa outfit, this was actually my own distemper foster. And I did let him play with all of my adult vaccinated dogs in my home. So they were able to intermingle. So he got the needed socialization that we want for him. And as I mentioned, new research, we can, for isolation periods for infected dogs where we have confirmed disease, for some of these dogs, we're clearing them in the ballpark of 2 to 4 weeks. So much, 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 much faster. Okay, and we talked about this one already, but again, what I was taught in school, right? Distemper is a death sentence. And many of you, it sounds like, also know this to be a myth, right? Like we can save these dogs. Depending on the resources available, depending on the severity of disease that we can treat, I've gotten more than a 93% survival rate in some outbreaks, even for shelters without the resources to treat intensively and just only treating the mild cases. We can get sometimes upwards of 85% survival, right? And I don't mean just exposed cases. I mean like confirmed cases of distemper, so 85 and above survival. Many, many, many of these dogs, it's just mild respiratory disease. Okay, so next up, let's talk about some of these specific updates. We'll talk more about that, how long they're contagious and what the newer research is showing us, as well as some other updates that I hope will help you not have to hang on to these dogs as long in your shelter. Okay, so diagnosis. Nothing around diagnosis has changed, but I will just to reiterate, the way that we diagnose this disease is we run a PCR test. And so that detects viral genetic material. And as we mentioned, if you are vaccinating with modified live vaccines, you can get vaccine interference. However, if we know we have confirmed disease in our shelter, we always want to assume that positives are real. Key point, as we've talked about already, is we can't diagnose this on clinical signs alone, unfortunately. And so if we are worried about this disease, we do need to PCR test. I occasionally get questions about these sorts of things. So point of care testing, right? Like we want a snap test for distemper. And if you look out there on the internet, you sometimes find things like these. I wish. These are too good to be true. These are not validated and they haven't actually been tested for reliability. Maybe someday we'll have this, but for now, we do not recommend using these. That PCR test is what we need to do. These tests will give you lots of false positives and false negatives. I found these images on Google on these websites. And so anytime we can order a test from Walmart or with a Apple Watch or a weekend wear, that should raise some red flags for you, right? If it is something that you can get on these websites rather than a veterinary distributor, I would start asking some questions. We need this, we want this, but these tests that exist out there in the world, unfortunately, they are not it. So we do need to send these out to a reference lab, but I would mention not all labs are created equal. Labs we recommend right now, it's IDEXX, Wisconsin, Cornell, and Purdue. There may be others that have a quality PCR test, but these are the ones that we know and we use and we rely on. And so as of right now, the labs that we recommend. And as we'll talk about, when we are interested in identifying when a dog is no longer contagious, we need a quantitative PCR result. What that means is that you get not just a positive or negative, but you also get a number. So with IDEXX, it's a viral count. With some of the other labs, it's reported out differently. But the key is that we have to look at what that viral count is doing over time. And what's important is you want to use the same lab. So if you start using IDEXX for your shelter, for following dogs out, we need to use the same lab because we can't match results and track things over time by mixing and matching labs. So whatever lab you start with on an individual dog, stick with that lab. Okay, so we used to talk about weeks or potentially even months of isolation. This handsome gentleman was a dog in our Harvey shelter who I ultimately adopted. His name is Franklin. He was testing PCR positive for distemper for just shy of 9 months. And at that time, we thought that we had to wait for multiple negative tests before we could clear him. We thought he was still contagious. And so we didn't just keep him in the shelter. He actually went to foster care. But I'm so excited. This is the update by far that I am the most excited about, is that these dogs are not contagious for as long as we once thought. Franklin probably could have gotten out in the ballpark of 3 to 4 weeks rather than almost 9 months. So this is a paper that came out, it's been out for a couple of years, but we have this research from Dr. Allen and the Wisconsin team looking not just at the PCR results, but really trying to isolate virus from infected dogs. And as it turns out, distemper virus is very similar to the measles virus. And we also see the same pattern with COVID. Just because you're testing positive on a PCR doesn't mean that you're necessarily still contagious. Okay, so again, let me say that again. Even if your PCR test is positive, you may not be contagious any longer. And that appears to be the case with distemper. So what are our criteria? How do we clear these dogs faster if we don't have to wait for a negative PCR? We need to do that quantitative PCR count. So we don't get just a positive or negative, but we get a number, and we want to see that number declining. Sometimes that number goes up and down a little bit. We want 2 PCR tests that are less than a peak count. So usually what will happen is they'll ramp up really quickly, we'll get a really high count, and then we'll get a number of results that are sort of fluctuating below that peak count. As long as we have 2 results below that peak count, that's going to be one of our criteria. And I will mention, this is conservative. We may at some point reduce this to just 1, right? But this is still relatively new, and so we're going to be a little conservative, right? For the most part, their clinical signs are resolving or have resolved completely. Sometimes we see neurological signs that are persistent, and so that's what the 2 little asterisks are for. And so we make a call with some of those cases, but generally the respiratory signs are resolving. And we want it to have been at least 14 days from the onset of signs. Again, this is just sort of us being conservative as we explore what clearing dogs this way looks like. And this QR code that I have on here, this is a link to where we have a library of medical protocols, including a distemper protocol that outlines all of these criteria in detail and gives it for you laid out in that protocol that you can adapt for your shelter. And as always, we are here to help support you if you have questions or need help sort of interpreting that or applying it to your shelter. This is the same dog that I showed you earlier on our neurological signs slide from our myths and misperceptions. Neurological signs can be that exception. And some dogs, they get these Neurological signs that take longer to go away or may never go away, and that's fine as long as it's not affecting their quality of life. But those definitely can persist, right? But as long as things are generally improving, we'll go ahead and still release them. And then my second comment related to neurological signs is that occasionally, and this is really uncommon, but occasionally we will see a delayed onset of neurological signs. It's a dog that had respiratory signs that are resolving or completely resolved, and then like weeks later, sometimes like 3 or 4 weeks later after that initial diagnosis, we start to see tremors like in this video. And in my experience, it can go a couple of different directions. Sometimes it just stays like this and stays mild. And very, very rarely, but particularly in puppies, it can become progressive. And so it's always a thing that I keep in the back of my mind and that I warn adopters and fosters about. Just keep an eye out for this, right? It is not a reason to not put these dogs into foster or to not adopt these dogs out, but it is something to keep in mind. As you start to treat more of these dogs, inevitably you will see one of them. Okay, so this is that dog who developed those signs, was a delayed onset. This dog, totally fine. So those signs eventually resolved. And so this is his dog playing at home with the other dog at home. When got adopted, lived normal life. All right, recent vaccination. So we mentioned this, right? If we're vaccinating with modified live vaccine, sometimes you can see this small percentage of dogs that will test positive for 1 to 2 weeks post-vaccination. Differing reports, differing experiences. The only data that's out there suggests it could be as high as 20% of healthy dogs that'll test positive. But I will tell you, in having tested a lot of dogs trying to get a positive after recent vaccination, we've actually gotten none, right? So in the face of known disease, right, we have to assume those positives are real. But what do we do, right, if we need to know for sure? So what if we have a recent vaccination and a positive PCR? Handle them cautiously and then retest them in 5 to 7 days. That value will they'll either be negative or it'll be like next to zero. So that's how we can for sure tell the difference. Okay, say you're in an outbreak situation. We have a number of dogs that we know are exposed. How can we clear these exposed dogs faster, right? So we have on the one hand, we have infected dogs that we're going to use those criteria to clear. We keep them in isolation or put them in isolation in foster care, right? But what about the rest of the dogs in the shelter? The dogs that look healthy right now, but oh my gosh, they've been exposed. This is a disease that has a potentially long incubation period. We use up to 2 weeks, so up to 14 days. But like, oh my gosh, I don't want to hold on to hundreds of dogs for 14 days in the shelter. Is there a way that we can clear them faster? And potentially there is. One way we can do this risk assessment to decide, like they've been exposed, are they actually at risk of getting sick, is looking at their age and vaccination status. This is unfortunately not as straightforward as it might seem, because what we need to pay attention to is their vaccination status at the earliest possible exposure. And what can happen a lot of times with distemper in shelters and the shelters that we work with is it has this insidious creep. Because it can look just like other respiratory disease, we don't realize until weeks into the outbreak that it's actually distemper that we have in our shelter. We think it's just regular SIRD, right, respiratory disease in the shelter. And it's when we finally get that dog that has neurological disease or we go transport it somewhere else and we hear back they tested positive. And so identifying the earliest possible exposure can sometimes be really difficult. What we're looking for, if you can identify that earliest possible exposure, maybe you know for sure which dog it was and when that was, they need to be at least 20 weeks of age and have had 2 vaccines at the earliest exposure. Even in adult dogs, sometimes it will take 2 vaccines, sometimes even more for them to respond. But 2 vaccines catches the vast majority of dogs. And so we can make a reasonable risk assessment. Would I guarantee that that dog is protected? Absolutely not. Nothing is 100% in medicine, but we can make a reasonable risk assessment that this dog is going to be really low risk. And remember, puppies are always, always, always high risk. Okay, what's another way? If we want to be more sure, we can use antibody titers, and you can use point of care kits like the one you see in the picture, or you can send these out to a lab. This is helpful early in an outbreak. The challenge here is that if you get a protective antibody titer, that means the immune system is responding to either a vaccine or to infection, right? And so if we get a protective titer result, what we can't tell just based on the titer result alone is if this is a vaccine protective titer, meaning this dog is protected, or if this is actually early infection and they just haven't started showing signs yet. This is useful for adults. It's not as useful for puppies, and happy to talk about the nuance there. Not to say we couldn't use it in puppies, but there's some caveats. If we want to for sure differentiate between infection versus vaccination protection, we run a PCR test right alongside this titer. And so this is a way that we can clear a lot of dogs much, much, much faster. If we have a reasonable suspicion that many of them are vaccine protected, we can use this in a combined way to get those dogs out really quickly. And the beauty of this is we can put them out into the world with a pretty strong assurance that they're not going to get sick. They can stay in the shelter and we can be pretty sure they're not going to get sick with distemper. They might get something else, right? But we can be pretty confident they're safe. They're bomb-proof dogs is kind of sometimes how we language that. And the more we do this, the more our transfer partners are getting used to what it means when we have this protective titer and a negative PCR test. And so sometimes this helps you get dogs out to transfer partners that are comfortable taking dogs if we have this. I put our QR code on this slide for we can help, right? Like this gets really complex sometimes, and like handling this over large populations of dogs, like this is where reach out to us, reach out to any of the shelter medicine academic programs if this is something you want to explore. Anytime you even think you maybe have an outbreak, like reach out to one of our programs and we can help you work through it. Okay, next, let's dive into outbreak prevention. Say this is a disease that you know exists out there in your community, or maybe you transport dogs from a place that has this. How do we make sure that distemper stays just a single case of one dog versus turning into an all-out outbreak in our own shelters? First, we need to understand at least a little bit about how distemper is transmitted in shelters. Like many diseases, dogs can spread this amongst one another if they are in direct contact with each other, right? So two dogs sharing a kennel, two dogs coming into nose-to-nose contact, either through the bars or as they're walking down the aisle, all of that certainly can spread it. Respiratory droplets are aerosols, right? Dogs sneezing, dogs coughing, dogs barking, right? So many of our respiratory pathogens are successfully aerosolized. And so that can be a pretty long distance for dogs in a shelter, up to 20 feet or more sometimes. That's important, especially in a crowded shelter. But I will tell you, by and large, the most important mechanism of transmission for this particular disease in our shelters is going to be fomites. The most clinically important is fomites, especially us, right? So what are fomites? These are any objects, equipment, anything we're using to clean, food and water bowls, toys, or us, right? My hands, my body. If I touch a dog that is shedding distemper and I was unaware that they were, I become contaminated and can potentially pass that on to the next dog. So I have a little video. This actually, so we staged this and it's with little stuffed cats, but I want you to pretend that these are stuffed puppies instead of stuffed cats. And so imagine this is Megan. And so she's taking these puppies. They came in and they were in a holding area and she's moving these puppies up to a different part of the shelter. They're going up to the adoption floor. So you'll see, she introduces herself to the puppies, takes those puppies, holds them, and she's going to move them into this kennel in order to take them up to a different part of the shelter. You'll notice she's not wearing gloves and she does hold this little puppy up next to her body. What you can't see is the invisible germs, right? And so we'll pretend in this case that it's distemper. We'll pretend that this puppy was shedding distemper. Our stuffed cat or stuffed puppy in the video was sprinkled with this black light fluorescing material. And so this is our pretend distemper. And this was Megan's hand after she handled that puppy. You'll also notice, even on her shirt top, right, because she was holding that puppy close to her body. Okay, so Megan then comes and is going to take the second puppy up to that same area. So a different puppy from a different litter was not infected, at least prior to this, right? Same thing, it's going to take that puppy and move that puppy up to a different part of the shelter. Put it up for adoption. And so this is the second puppy, right? Did not have any of this germ on it to start with. But when we examine this puppy under the black light, we can see that this puppy would now be infected with distemper. In order to take these pictures and to use the black light, we had to go into a storage closet, right? And so we shut the door, and this was an accident, right? But this also, our door handle is contaminated with distemper, right? So that door handle is a fomite. And so the next person that touches that door handle is then going to become contaminated with distemper. And if they go introduce themselves to another dog, then they will potentially transmit that disease. This was another scenario we did with a broom handle, same thing, right? Like that broom handle is also a fomite. And so you can see, especially if dogs are contagious before they start showing the obvious clinical signs, right? Like this is a disease that we can be responsible for spreading to many, many, many animals throughout our shelters because of this fomite transmission. Okay, so that's a little bit about how distemper is commonly transmitted in shelters. So it's dogs coming into contact with other dogs. It is through respiratory droplets or aerosols, and it is through fomites. It's us, and we really are the one. Like that is the place where we can do a lot to prevent, and we'll talk about that as well as some other strategies. With those mechanisms of transmission in mind, how do we, like, what are the risk factors for outbreaks that we see in shelters that we consult with? And we'll talk about each of these, and this informs our strategies for prevention. So I mentioned our team at Best Friends consults with tons of shelters every year, and distemper is one of the most common diseases that we see. And these are the risk factors that are associated with shelters that experience outbreaks. And these are the leverage points if you want to prevent outbreaks of distemper and other serious diseases in your shelter. So what we see shelters that don't have effective sanitation practices, shelters that are over capacity, so too many dogs, lots of overcrowding, shelters that have an inadequate vaccination strategy or inadequate vaccination overall, if we have shelters that are not isolating sick pets, or if we have inadequate biosecurity, especially for those sick pets or vulnerable pets. I want to share some stories, and so each of these stories that I'll share throughout this next part of the talk, each of these is based on a real shelter outbreak that we consulted on. So this one is from a shelter in Texas that sees distemper routinely coming in from the community. We do see this in a reasonable number of places, either due to disease in community dogs or to wildlife reservoirs. So either one of those situations can happen. This is a shelter that was really experienced with distemper though. However, they were experiencing an uptick in disease, including when they dug into the data and was seeing how long dogs were in the shelter before they were presenting with disease. They were able to determine that there was some in-shelter transmission happening. This wasn't just dogs that were coming in and really quickly developing disease, where we can say these likely, this disease was transmitted out there in the community and then they broke with it once they got here. But these were dogs that had a longer length of stay when they got sick. And so that meant they were contracting this disease in the shelter. In this particular situation, we started asking some more questions, and the shelter had switched the type of vaccine that they were using. They had switched from a modified live vaccine to this recombinant distemper vaccine. How do we know it's a recombinant vaccine? So you can see on here it says canary pox vector. It also says modified live, and so this is really, really, really tricky. And if you have any questions about the vaccine you're using, I encourage you to reach out to us or a similar shelter medicine program. The modified live in this situation is referring to the parvo component. The canary pox vector is the distemper component. And so this is a recombinant distemper vaccine. And the challenge here is that recombinant vaccines are effective, but they take much, much, much longer, and they don't generate as strong of an immune response as a modified live vaccine does. And so in shelter scenarios where we know we have lots of dogs and we have vulnerable dogs and we have lots of potential for disease exposure, we always recommend a modified live vaccination. And so we believe the shelter outbreak, this corresponded with their switch to this recombinant distemper vaccine. Okay, so when it comes to vaccination, we should use modified live vaccines. We should vaccinate according to shelter guidelines. Be sure that we're storing and handling our vaccines appropriately, and that we're using our medical records, we're using our shelter software to ensure that we're giving those second, or with puppies even more, third, fourth, fifth doses on time, because even with adults, it can take 2 or more vaccines for them to be protected. What are the shelter guidelines, right? And so here's our standard chart. We start by 4 weeks of age, and I have on here even younger. We are recommending in high-risk shelter scenarios vaccinating as early as day 1, right? So how much younger? Day 1, right? Vaccinating neonates. We are going to vaccinate if they're in the shelter. I vaccinate on the dot every 2 weeks. If they're in foster care, maybe we'll stretch that out to 3 weeks, but the guidelines say 2 to 3 weeks. We keep vaccinating out to 20 weeks of age for our juvenile animals, and even for adults, we give a second dose, right? And this is because of distemper, because many of these dogs won't respond to that first vaccine. Okay, this is a thing I hear in shelter sometimes or in rescue groups. This 10-week puppy, he's had 3 vaccines already. He's protected. We don't need to wear gloves with him anymore. And what I cannot repeat enough is that no, we don't know for sure that he is because of maternal antibodies and their interference with vaccines. We never know for sure that young animals are protected until they reach a certain age. And so it's 2 vaccines given when they're at least 4 months of age or 16 weeks of age or older, which means they're going to be 18 or more weeks of age. It doesn't matter how many vaccines they've had. And this could be like 9 vaccines, 10 vaccines, right? Until they reach that age threshold and have had at least 2 vaccines, I don't know for sure that they're protected. Okay, and I'm gonna recognize we're talking about canine distemper. There are cats on this slide, but we're just broadly talking about vaccination in shelters. And so this will be another poll for you all. Who gets vaccinated? Which of these pets would you vaccinate upon intake to your shelter? The 6-week-old puppy and kitten, the 2-week-old puppy and kitten, the nursing dog or cat, the pregnant dog or cat, or the sick or injured dog or cat? And I'll give you all a little bit of time to answer. All right, still creeping up a little bit. Seems to have slowing down. Get your answers in. All right, I'm gonna end it. And then I'll show the results. Okay, so almost all of you would vaccinate that 6-week-old puppy or kitten. Some of you, about 3/4, would vaccinate that 2-week-old puppy or kitten. Okay, this is really exciting. I like that. About the same for the nursing dog or cat. A little fewer for the pregnant dog or cat, and then back up to that about 3/4 for that sick or injured. Okay, so who gets vaccinated? My answers to this question. Let's stop sharing that. Okay, so 6-week-old puppy or kitten, definitely. Existing shelter guidelines that we've had around for many, many, many years say 4 weeks of age or older. And so I would definitely vaccinate the 6-week-old, no questions. Pregnant and nursing, I would also vaccinate them. We could talk a lot about potential myths and misperceptions that are out there about any sort of risk associated with it. What I will tell you is it's potential risk. We don't know if it's real. What I do know is very, very, very real is the risk of parvo and panleuk and distemper in our shelters. And so I want to protect mom for sure, and the puppies or kittens if I can. And so I am going to vaccinate these animals as well as sick or injured puppies and kittens or dogs and cats. And even the 2-week-old puppy or kitten. Now, if there's in a high-risk shelter scenario, staying in that high-risk shelter, there's a reasonable chance this vaccine is going to be effective. And so I am definitely going to vaccinate them too. For those of you that have seen me present on this topic before, I used to have a question mark on this slide. It is no longer a question mark. If this 2-week-old puppy and kitten are staying in our shelter, they get vaccinated. And so my answer to this question is if you are staying alive in my shelter, you get vaccinated. So the answer to this question is everyone. As I mentioned, we want to make sure we're storing and handling our vaccines appropriately. They lose efficacy. This is particularly important for distemper. And so while we love these little mini fridges, right, they're so convenient. We can put them in our intake area. We know they freeze things or they don't maintain temperature cold. All the cold air goes out every time you open it. And so while I understand that they're convenient, if we want to do something like that, we need to actually shell out for the medical grade fridge and track that temperature in that refrigerator. If we're taking vaccines out into the shelter to do a bunch of, for example, second doses of vaccine, make sure we're putting them in the cooler, but making sure also, again, they're not freezing. And for any vaccines that we have to mix up, we want to make sure that we're mixing them right before we administer them. Again, with distemper, the concern is if we mix them up too soon, that it's going to lose efficacy. Okay, so here's another outbreak scenario that I will share with you, again, based on a real outbreak. So this was a shelter in Texas. It was a limited intake shelter, but primarily took animals from the local municipal shelter. They were contractually obligated to take in a number of dogs directly from that shelter. This was a shelter that had widespread infectious respiratory disease in their dog population, so much that they ran out of space in isolation. And so they just stopped isolating dogs that were coughing, that had nasal discharge, right? ISO full, so we'll just keep these dogs in general population. When we got involved, they had respiratory disease in every different area of their shelter. We got involved because one litter of puppies started to develop neurological signs. And so this gets back to that, like for every dog with neurological signs, right? Like it's only about 10% that develop those neurosigns. And so there are 9 more SIRD dogs in your shelter with distemper. And that was indeed the case, right? By the time we got involved, the widespread CIRD in the shelter was actually distemper. The upside of all of this is because of this like insidious creep of this disease and not recognizing it was distemper, by the time we got there, a lot of the adult dogs had actually pretty much recovered from it, and we were able to clear some of these dogs using these new guidelines, right? And so it turned out to be to those dogs' benefit, right? The key here, though, is that if you're not isolating infectious respiratory disease in your dogs, it's okay until it's not, right? Until you get a serious pathogen like distemper in your population. And again, we don't know that it's distemper until it's too late. So we always do recommend isolating infectious respiratory disease. If you're in this situation though, and you don't know what to do, this is a great opportunity to reach out to us for help, and we can talk through the best option that allows you to save those lives and deal with the respiratory disease in your shelter without having to make some tough decisions. Sometimes I hear, right, like, well, we know if we had distemper in our shelter, right? But again, it's reiterating this point that the vast majority of them, it looks just like SIRD. Or sometimes we don't even see any signs at all, or signs that are so mild that we don't recognize it in the shelter. Okay, so what do? We need to recognize it rapidly, and we need to isolate those dogs. And so isolating them from the rest of the population. And if you don't have an isolation space, or your isolation space is full, considering things like foster care. It is key for all of your staff to know how to recognize this disease, or recognize infectious disease in general, and to know what happens next. What do I do when I see this dog with a snotty nose in population? Who do I tell? Who's responsible for moving that dog to isolation? What timeline do they need to be moved? And the key here is having clear protocols and having that accountability built in, right? And in the shelters that we work with, my recommendation is always disease recognition should be everyone's job, from high level leadership all the way down to frontline staff, even our volunteers know what infectious disease looks like, and they know what they're supposed to do when they recognize it in the population. But oh my gosh, we don't have an isolation ward, so what do, right? I have some solutions for you, right? Considering foster care is always the big one, but it's also about getting creative, particularly if you say foster care is your longer term solution, right? But you need to do something with them right now. We work with many shelters that are just like one big warehouse space. And so this is an example. This is actually an emergency response shelter, but you can see the green tarp that's on some of that kennel paneling. And so even if all you have is a big warehouse, right, it's putting up tarps and just providing some sort of barrier. And I'll be honest, this is much a barrier and a visual for the staff as it really is for prevention of disease. Like they're all in the same room, they're all sharing the same airspace. But as we talked about, it's fomite transmission. It's really the biggie when it comes to this disease. And so really it's about having separate staff caring for the healthy dogs versus the sick dogs. Or again, I'm not advocating for these to be long-term solutions, but if we just need a place to put a couple of dogs while we're waiting for foster, right? It's making isolation spaces or repurposing rooms in our shelter that we're not using for what they were originally intended to. Here's some extreme examples, but lots of longer-term solutions that are rooms that used to be cat housing that we can turn into isolation for dogs or for puppies, or offices that we can convert to animal housing. And so the key here is like look at broadly all the spaces that you have, and especially if you're really, really leveraging foster care, right? Like we can come up with temporary solutions for these dogs. And then again, I can't say it enough. Fostering saves lives. So here's a couple. So we saw Reggie earlier wearing his little Santa outfit, but this is also Scoobert Dubert from a different shelter. Again, both dogs that were part of actual shelter outbreaks. And we can use foster for just respiratory disease isolation. We can use it for distemper isolation once they were confirmed, right? And that's these 2 dogs. Or if we just have dogs that were exposed, right, we can use it as a quarantine space. Okay, so here's another shelter outbreak that I'll tell you about. This is a Louisiana shelter that we consulted at. Their dogs, what they were seeing was that their dogs were breaking with distemper in about the 10 to 14 day window into their shelter stay. And that is the common incubation period that we see for distemper. And so we started asking questions and started exploring a little bit. And as it turns out, these dogs, they were getting exposed early in their shelter stay, was what we were, based on this timeline, what we thought. And while the shelter had some reasonable practices in place, what wasn't happening was the cleaning and sanitation in between animals on their animal control trucks. So dogs were either getting exposed on the animal control truck by being put in a space, a shared airspace with other dogs, or they were getting put into a dirty truck, right? And so the truck in this situation is the fomite transmission. And so that was when we addressed that slowed down that transmission. So this brings us to sanitation. When we talk about sanitation in shelters, we talk about 4 steps. We want to remove all the debris first. We remove the food, remove the poop, right? It's not possible to disinfect poop, right? So we have to remove all that stuff first. We now recommend a separate degreasing step. Just Dawn dish soap is actually my favorite product for this. It removes any of the films and what we call biofilms that are on these surfaces. Some of our pathogens in shelters can live in puddles, even in the presence of disinfectant. And so we need to break down all of that gunk first. And so that's the degreasing step. Then we apply our disinfectant for the right contact time at the right dilution. And then we want it to be dry before we put animals back into those kennels. We always recommend measuring every single time. So either a commercial dilution system, one of these like measured hose attachments, right? What we don't want to do is eyeball it. And if you don't know about it, if you're using rescue, which is effective against the all pathogens that we care about the most in shelters, there's these little strips that allow you to test what your rescue dilution is. And even if you're using a commercial system, I recommend that you use these and that you double check, because we've seen situations where it wasn't set up properly, or the water pressure was variable, and so they weren't getting the concentration. Here's a strip, so you can see that matches up to about the 1:32, if that was the dilution we were going for. This doesn't match any of them. On this little test strip, I tested a bottle of rescue that was used to clean a kennel for a dog that was exposed to for a puppy that was exposed to parvo. And so that, had that puppy been shedding parvo, if he was about to get sick, that kennel would have remained contaminated. So highly recommend these if you haven't seen them before. Fomites though, right? So especially with distemper, it's common equipment. And so here's a couple of examples of equipment that's been sprayed. But is our disinfectant making contact with all of the surfaces? And the answer is no, right? So not gonna reliably disinfect these pieces of equipment. And we need to wait for contact time. So disinfectant making contact with all the surfaces and for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, depending on your concentration. And that is a long time to wait. And so just physical barriers, right? We can come up with other solutions. So don't let your scale be a fomite, right? We can just lay a piece of newspaper, whatever things that we can do to take steps to reduce that cross-contamination. And then just other means of physical prevention, like we need to not be the fomites. So using personal protective equipment, that's gloves, that's gowns. Maybe maybe it's an adult animal and it's not like putting on a full gown because it's a healthy appearing adult dog, like you can see in the photo, getting induced for anesthesia, but just putting a blanket to protect our bodies from becoming contaminated. And then making sure when we put on and take off this equipment that we're doing it in a way that is not also contaminating ourselves. And then making sure that we're changing it in between animals. Okay, one of the last sort of strategies for prevention that I want to talk about is around population management. The 2 big keys here are population density and animal movement. We see this disease spread in crowded shelters, especially in crowded shelters where there's a lot of animal movement. You all know, you've seen this, right? Like the dogs are stressed, the staff are stressed. We don't have time to do all the things the way that we may have in our protocols. And so sometimes we cut corners. Sometimes it's just impossible to clean appropriately when you're cleaning in kennels that are doubled down and the transfer doors are shut and we have, 1 dog on either side or even 2 dogs on either side of that, right? So with an illustration, let's look at both of these, the impact of population density and the impact of movement on disease spread, particularly for distemper, but could be any disease in the shelter. Okay, so imagine your full shelter. Every single kennel is full with a dog in it, maybe even dogs on either side of the transfer door. Maybe even we're overfull. And so we have one dog who starts coughing because he got distemper. He caught it out in the community. He comes in, he starts coughing, and he coughs his distemper 20 feet, right? And so that's this circle here. And I think about 20 feet in a crowded shelter, right? It's a dog and their neighbors across the aisle and their neighbors on the other side of the transfer door, right? So it could be a lot of dogs that are now infected, right? And so in this full shelter scenario, he makes 17 other dogs sick. Okay, well, now we have a different scenario. Same dog comes in, breaks, starts coughing, but not every kennel is full. We have a little bit more space. Some of the kennels are empty. In the same scenario, he potentially does expose other dogs, right? But it's only 7 dogs in this situation, which is still not great, but it's better than 17. And hopefully we identify him early and we pull him out of Gen Pop before he heavily contaminates all these other dogs and gets them sick. Okay, let's look at movement, right? So our patient 0, that first dog, he infected all these other dogs, but they don't start showing signs immediately, right? It takes a little bit of time. But these dogs start moving around the shelter. And so that guy moves and he gets a new neighbor. And then he starts coughing, right? So he infects these dogs in addition to all the other dogs that patient 0 exposed, right? And so then they get sick. And every time we move a dog, right, that will continue to happen, right? And so this guy moves here and he starts coughing and he infects that dog, right? And so with these, my little dog icons, we can kind of illustrate the impact of both population density and of movement, right? So the more dense we are and the more the dogs move around the shelter, every movement is a chance to expose new neighbors, not to mention like our staff are handling these dogs. We have staph and fomite transmission risk every time we're doing this. So as much as we can, if we can reduce overcrowding and limit that animal movement as much as possible, that can reduce the spread of disease in our shelters, not just for distemper, but for any infectious disease. Our team, we are seeing the same things that many of you are likely experiencing and that we know shelters are experiencing across the country, right? And that's shelters that are overcrowded and especially for medium and large dogs are staying longer. That is a challenge everywhere right now, and I want to acknowledge that. But reach out to us for help. We can help with that, trying to reduce length of stay and keep those animals moving. You are not alone. Again, we know we're hearing it from everyone, but these are things that we can help with. So I encourage you to reach out to our team. Let's talk more. All right, wrapping up. Distemper is not a death sentence. Many of you even have done this already, about 1/3 of you are saving dogs with distemper, which I love. Prevention, right? Our big strategies here, it's biosecurity, it's sanitation, it's vaccinating on intake with modified live vaccine, it's continuing to revaccinate. And as much as we can, it's reducing that length of stay and movement. If we recognize disease in our shelters, it's recognizing it quickly and it's isolating those dogs, right? And if you are dealing with upticks in infectious disease, a lot of infectious disease, even just capacity challenges, or if you think there's any chance you may have an outbreak, I encourage you, reach out for help. Reach out to us, and I'll provide our contact info again at the end, or any number of the consultative programs that are out there, the shelter medicine academic programs, or some of the other nonprofit organizations. Just reach out to us. We can help, and we can help you strategize the resources that you do have in the most effective way possible. Saving distemper dogs is within reach. And I would say for becoming more and more within reach for shelters, our team works with open intake municipal shelters that are saving distemper positive dogs. We can help navigate the communication with community, with government officials, how to pause intake, again, even in open admission shelters, and how we can strategize using the resources that are available to manage that outbreak. And so if you take away one single thing from our webinar today, it's ask for help from us or any of the other programs that are doing it. And that is so we can start to save more of these dogs. And maybe in your shelter, it's not saving all of the infected dogs, right? Like that's a heavy lift, but maybe it's some of them. Or maybe it's even just one distemper positive dog, right? That's how it starts. And that's how we shift what is defined as savable in shelters. We can save distemper dogs. And so the last thing I'll share, the question I asked all of you at the beginning about how many of you have saved a distemper dog. I've asked that question in many, many, many rooms over many sessions over many years now. And when I used to ask that question, I would get maybe like one or two hands. Like I would raise my hand and I would get a couple other people. And now sometimes it's like here today in our virtual room, it's a third of people, or it's even half the room, right? And so that's my challenge to all of you. Whatever your resources are, wherever you are, right? Can you save even just one distemper dog? If you don't have distemper in your area, can you help a shelter that does? If you have resources, transfer in dogs that are exposed in an outbreak, or they're new dogs when they deal with an outbreak. Help them divert their new intake. Every single one of us has a part to play, and like so much in our industry, right? We maximize life saving when we work together. We can save the lives of distemper dogs in shelters, and this is only going to get bigger and bigger, right? And we can save more lives. I hope that some of the resources, some of the updates that we've given you today will help you to do that, or to help shelters that want to do more of that. If you want handouts, protocols, things for adopters, all of that, so our medical protocols, samples of those, as well as for any other number of diseases and conditions we see in shelters, are available with that QR code. If you need help, if you have questions, I will see what we have in the Q&A box right now with just a couple minutes left. But feel free to reach out to us via our online form, or just email us at sheltermedicine@bestfriends.org. And with that, I'll leave those QR codes and that contact information up. And I'm gonna take a look in the chat and Q&A and see what we might have. Let's see, what did you do to expand the room for ISO for that shelter that stopped isolating dogs? Yeah, so oftentimes what happens is once we get tagged to come in and help, we help them recognize that it's an actual outbreak situation. And so oftentimes like that's essentially the crisis that allows us to pause intake and allows us to get the population back down to a manageable level. And so we almost get a reset, right? And so for many of these shelters, we have that reset. And so then we get back into a population that's manageable, and we stay on top of isolating those sick dogs. We expand our foster care program so we can keep sick dogs just in isolation. Or we get creative with the other spaces that we have. And so maybe our isolation just isn't enough kennels if it's only one or two, but we'll designate like a row of Gen Pop as isolation. And even that is better than no isolation. And so it's just like using some of these other creative solutions. And don't let like perfect be the enemy of good. Even if we can just provide some degree of separation, oftentimes that's enough, right? And that is better than doing nothing and just leaving them in Gen Pop.
There's one in the chat, Dr. Erin, that says we are using Novavax 8-in-1 vaccine. Thoughts on this vaccine?
Let's see, so Novavax modified live, the Novavax distemper or Novavax combo vaccine is a modified live distemper vaccine. And so for the distemper component, that should be good. And then there's a Q&A that is, if you have fully vaccinated healthy adult dogs exposed to distemper, do you do any testing or isolation before adopting? Advise a doctor. And so this is where, like I mentioned, it can get tricky, right? Just like ensuring that we know the earliest possible exposure point, and if they were in fact vaccinated and were protected before. This is a place where I'll employ a titer if I want to be really, really, really sure. And I just have a conversation, right? Like we're facing some distemper in our shelter, so like watch out. Like any concerning signs, dog gets sick or anything, like give us a call. Ensuring that other pets that they have at home, recommending vaccination for those dogs, just like we would in any situation, if I'm honest, right? And I'm completely comfortable putting these dogs in homes with other adult vaccinated dogs, but it's just that conversation. So to your point, like, yes, I would advise the adopter mention it. My goal is to make it not scary though, but have a conversation about, are there other animals at home where that could potentially be a risk? And if they have a brand new puppy at home, like maybe we should wait a little bit, right? But healthy adult vaccinated dogs, 100% comfortable. All right, with just one more minute, I think we'll wrap up. If you have any other questions that come up, let us know. We'll have this posted to YouTube, to our YouTube playlist in hopefully not too long. And so it'll be available for you to share with other staff. And again, if you need any assistance, we are here to help support you. If you want to know more about distemper, need help with disease, need help with just your population management, reach out to us. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.